Hi, and thank you for watching these videos at the Audrain Museum Network. We really prize our viewers, and we've seen millions of views, thanks to you. Why not take the next step and subscribe, and be notified when we get new content here in the channel. Be a superbird. Come subscribe to the Audrain Museum Network. Jay, nothing says classic motoring like coming down Bellevue Avenue in this wonderful Mercedes convertible.
Yeah, this is a 1971 3.5. This was the new V8, which was introduced, I think, the previous year in 70.
1970. Mm-hmm.
This was their full entree into the American market. They had to have a V8. I mean, Mercedes six-cylinder engines were great, but Cadillac was a V8, Lincoln, Imperial. Americans know that more cylinders means more power, means more smoothness, means more light.
So all cars, of course, were
Right.
sold for less money than the equivalent Mercedes model.
Right. And the other cool thing about this, these are the last of the true coach-built Mercedes. Hand-built in the old factories. This is the remnants of all those great cars they built after the war, you know.
The 300
Yeah,
S's
the 300,
and
the
SCs.
the Adenauer, all of those ones, you know. I have a coupe of one of these. I had one when I was a kid because you could buy them fairly cheaply. And then I bought one a couple of years ago. I got it out of Vegas. It had been in the desert. The paint had been bleached out, but it wasn't bad. And these engines are pretty bulletproof. So we painted it, got it running, and now I enjoy driving it. And this is probably the last car you can actually use hide food in, you know. People buy all these leather cleaners, but nowadays, leather you get is sealed. It's not even really what you would call, this leather has that rich aromatic smell. You either like it or you don't. You put the hide food in, you can feel it become more supple, and I mean, it's really the best kind of leather.
And in a car like this, you really get the sense of why you would use leather and wood, sort of traditional coach building and coach materials, because this is the type of car this is.
Right,
you know?
right.
The wonderful burl wood on the dashboard really feels quite in place with this car. And to your point about Mercedes sort of finally stepping it up to get what the American luxury market wanted, this is a car with air conditioning and power windows, and of course, the top on this car is absolutely legendary, because it's convertible, but when the top is closed, the multi-layer top and the lining in it,
Yeah.
it's as if you're in a coupe.
That's right. Is this an electric top? No.
Electric top.
Oh, it is electric
Yes.
top, okay. Because I remember for a while they weren't. But they still never got that American secret of making the top disappear.
No.
You know, you got to get out and put
Like the baby carriage
put
thing.
the boot over it. Yeah. But just wonderful driving cars. They really are impressive. This is a wonderful successor to the 220. We drove that a couple of years ago
Yes.
on one of the other episodes. And that was what, a 61, I think.
That was a 60, was it 58? It was a late car, no, 61.
A 61, yeah. So this shows you what 10 years of development can do. You know,
And-
it's funny, but even this is still
An addition.
a bit of an afterthought, the way it's not integrated into the dash quite yet, because Germans and Europeans really didn't buy air conditioning. It just seemed like an expensive thing. Why would you do that, you know?
Especially for a convertible. I mean, the top goes down, so you have all the air you need.
And you know, it's so funny, for all the European prowess and engineering, they could never do heating and cooling like American cars. I mean, this, when you turn on this motor, I mean, you hear the fan going. You feel you got to put your foot down, a little more gas because the compressors. You know, So, but they're on their way. But the craftsmanship, the level of detail. I mean, this is all beautiful wood. This is not plastic. You know, it all comes from the same tree. The grains all going the same way. If that's important to you, you know. But when you have something like this, which is a piece of rolling artwork, I think it is important.
Yeah, so do I, and this is also a great blend of something that Mercedes was really known for, the idea of luxury and more than adequate performance.
Yeah, and it really exudes class, because it's not, American convertibles in this period are so huge. I mean, they're comically huge. When I drive my 58 Imperial, people like laugh out, oh my God, how big is that thing? You know, it looks so ridiculous.
Again, without even going back to the 50s, look at 1971. A 1971 Cadillac Eldorado convertible is like an aircraft carrier.
Yeah, I know.
You know, and when you think about the fact that looking for what the market wanted, although this, I remember from my youth that this is a car that it was so incredibly subtle, and yet it really portrayed the fact that you were really wealthy if you drove one of these cars.
Yeah, I remember working at the dealership. I did new car prep, you know, put the license plates on and all that stuff. I remember looking at the window sticker on one of these. It was $13,500. In fact, Mercedes-Benz used to run an ad in the early 70s. Why would anyone pay $10,000 for a four-door sedan? And then it listed all the reasons why, because of the crash proof, and Mercedes was leading the world then in those days in safety technology. You know, engines that went under the car in a crash.
They actually patented the crumple zone, the front crumple zone. It was a Mercedes patent.
Well, they patented it, but they also gave it away.
Yes.
You know, so they wanted every car to be safe. So I give them credit for that. Yeah, no, they really were safety minded. Them and Volvo before anybody else. You know. I mean, we had huge, like a saber-like thing sticking out of the steering column that would impale you, like the Jaguar. The Jaguar had that cone that would literally puncture your
and meanwhile, Mercedes has a pad in the middle of the wheel.
Yeah, exactly. To catch you. Yeah.
It was also something, the fact that this is sort of, to me, always growing up in New York City and seeing some of these cars around, I always thought this is the quintessential sort of Beverly Hills car. You know, you're a big movie producer in Beverly Hills and you drive one of these cars. You might, if you're a banker, drive a coupe, but the convertible was a Hollywood producer's car.
Well, that's funny that you say that, because I always think of this as something above that. I think of this more as Connecticut, Greenwich, Connecticut, rather than Hollywood. Because Hollywood would be the Eldorado convertible, you know, with the big chrome, over-chromed radiator, the aftermarket one. These always were sort of, this is Audrey Hepburn, whereas America was Jane Mansfield, you know what I mean?
Although one of the things I also love about the Mercedes of this period, also the wonderful extended wheelbase sedans, the 280 SEL, 3.5 and 4.5, I think just one of the most wonderful sedans. I mean, obviously not comparing them to the 6.3.
Right.
And of course, that's one of the things, I'm sure you've run into this, a couple of people have actually put 6.3 engines in the coupes and convertible.
That was quite a popular swap.
And it's an interesting thing, though, because you think about sort of the character of the car. Does the big, really fast engine suit this car? Because it's not sporty in any particular way, and somehow in the sedan, it's got that whole sort of Q-ship thing going on.
Yeah, but there is something nice to effortless power. You know, like almost like a steam engine that just, I used to call steam power the hand of God, because there's no revolution involved. As soon as you open the throttle, the pistons move, and like, oh my God, without any noise or engine revving, you're thrust forward. It's like, whoa, 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 what's that? You know, it's like when you're a ship that's moving, you go, hey, what's going on?
And that's what you really want in a luxury car.
Yeah.
You know, to not feel that sense of effort. which again was one of the reasons why the Mercedes inline sixes are spectacular engines, but they're much more mechanical than this V8.
Right. Something I always thought was uniquely Mercedes was the white steering wheel.
Yes.
It seems so impractical because then you got to clean the wheel all the time because your hands are dirty or greasy.
Well, you're not wearing your driving gloves, Jay.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Well, you know.
Actually, this is the perfect car for these roads. You know, it's funny when the speed limit was 55 miles an hour. That was perfect for convertibles.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the reason I think convertibles, well, they outlawed them. Remember, they didn't outlaw.
Well, they thought they were going to outlaw them because of the rollover rules.
Right. It
They
was
had
a
to make
voluntary ban.
Yeah.
General Motors, everybody stopped making convertibles because speeds had increased to 75, 80 miles an hour, and suddenly getting blown all over the place. You know, like on a road like this, 45 to 50. You know, everything is still.
That's also a gift of a designer as well, to design a convertible that can actually protect the occupants while still giving them the air.
Right.
The way this windshield is built, sitting in the front seat of this car is perfectly comfortable.
Right.
The back seat of this car is a fairly windy place.
Right, yeah. Well,
like
that's
being
what's
in a
great
speedboat.
about the old, I've got the Duesenberg with the two windshields,
Right.
so you can adjust it in the back, so.
But it's also something, again, that a car like this, as I said, not certainly built as a sports car, but, you know, handles pretty well.
It does, and you know, in Germany, this was the big V8. Here, it was a small, I think
Right.
it's, what is it, about 260 cubic inches? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, it's 3.5 liters, so about that, yeah. So it's like a small block Ford V8.
Yeah, it's like a lot of times when I read the English magazines, they test the Mustang with the big block 289 in it. You know, there you go. As much as I enjoy driving this vehicle, we have to go somewhere. So what tenuous connection have you found with this convertible and the home we're going to see?
Jay, it will be so obvious that you'll say, I could have had a V8.
That's right.
The house we're going to today is called Bellevue House.
Right.
Well, that's not its original name, but that really doesn't matter.
Now, that's not the asylum where you grew up, right? That was in New York.
Exactly.
I see where you have a kinship with it. So you spent years in Bellevue.
It's like going home.
You were not in the criminally insane wing, just the regular.
Just the criminal wing.
Right, okay. All right,
So the house that we're going to today, Bellevue House, is an absolute quintessential example of classicism in architecture.
Okay.
And this is the quintessence of classicism in an automobile.
By classicism, you mean not the hoi polloi.
Classic, enduring, elegant, tasteful, balanced.
Right. As opposed, but yeah, obviously in the best sense of the word.
In the best sense of the word, exactly.
But not classes as in elitist.
Classes
as
classic. Classic as in timeless.
Right.
And this house, which is designed by Ogden Codman, a very noted architect for a number of reasons we'll discuss when we get to the house, is sort of a reaction against some of the excess of Newport.
Right.
And just as this car is a reaction to the excess of a convertible like the Eldorado. So I think you'll see a very interesting comparison.
Yeah, all right. Well, I've just enjoyed driving this car so much. You know, I've got the coupe, but this really is a wonderful convertible.
Perfect day for it. So here we are at Bellevue House. The original name of this house was actually Berkeley House, designed by Ogden Codman, 1910, in the colonial revival style. Ogden Codman was a real classicist. He, of course, wrote the wonderful book on the decoration of houses with Edith Wharton.
Right, and who hasn't read that?
Well, anyone who watches Mansions and Motorcars should have read it by now, since we mentioned it in our first season. So I'm sure that on their reading list.
I saw the video, but I haven't read the book. But go ahead.
It's fantastic.
Oh.
Keira Knightley is just
Really?
just unforgettable as Edith Wharton. But they were both very much classicists, and although they spent time here in Newport, Edith Wharton had two houses here in Newport before she left for the Berkshires, and Ogden Codman actually ended up with a house here, a little cottage called Sans-Souci, without care.
Right.
They both were sort of objecting to the excesses of Newport. So although this house is Gilded Age, 1910, it appears to be a very sober sort of New England house.
Yeah, it does have that, yeah, kind of New England look to it in the sense that nothing that doesn't need, the columns are the only slightly pretentious part to it, but even those blend in nicely, don't they? If, you know, there's not a lot of gold or any of that kind of nonsense on it.
One of the things that Ogden Codman was really very much in favor of was this kind of balance and symmetry that was typical in Italian architecture from the 15th, 16th, 17th century. And so you see it very clearly in this house and in one of the most spectacular features of this house, which is the central rotunda. This amazing space that rises.
Yeah, I've heard about that. I'm anxious to see that.
Yeah, it's an amazing space. Rises to a dome, which is modeled on that of the City Hall in New York City, and this wonderful circular staircase that wraps around the walls, and very tasteful decorations on the wall as well, and very almost Adamesque decor on the mantles and on the walls.
Right.
It's a really wonderful thing. And the real magic of this property as it exists today is because of the current owner of the house, Mr. Ronald Fleming, who was a brilliant and renowned horticulturalist and gardener, and has created 12 distinct gardens on this 3.5-acre plot here in the center of Newport.
Well, let's take a look.
Absolutely, come on. So as you can see, Jay, one of the other connections, not quite so tenuous, in the cars that we picked today for Bellevue House is that they're all open cars.
Right.
So nature, taking in nature, and the parkland of this house is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, it's pretty
12
amazing.
different gardens here in this 3.5 acres. And one of my favorite buildings on the property, something which is new construction, built in 2016, this amazing 2-story library.
And you have stretched the word tenuous to its most finite conclusion. I mean, yes, I mean, one more inch and you'd be, I'm sorry, it's no longer a tenuous connection. But all right, since I like the car so much, I love the property, I'm willing to accept that.
Excellent, glad to hear it.
The tenuous connection of the cars and the house here is nature. And while Bellevue House is undoubtedly an architectural masterpiece, it is also the gardens created by its current owner, Ronald Lee Fleming, a fellow of the American Institute of Certified Planners, that make this home truly remarkable. The founder of the Townscape Institute, he has brought to life a series of gardens which fill the 3.5 acres of the property. Each has its own very different personality, inspired by gardens in the Netherlands, Scotland, England, Japan, and Italy, and yet all tied together by a sense of unerring detail and complete appropriateness for the estate, combining the seemingly natural with the carefully contrived. Formal allées echo the symmetry of Ogden Codman's design for the house, while other areas offer that wonderful sense of the seemingly wild, which allows the visitor to transition effortlessly from one feeling to another. Contemporary sculptural art is intermingled with nature in the gardens, bringing added life and more than a bit of humor to the scene, a great example of how Newport's grand historic properties still live and evolve in the present. Complementing the newly created outdoor spaces are thoughtful and beautifully crafted new structures, including various follies, pools, and a guest house with a magnificent library and a dramatic and unexpected grotto bathroom. All this and more can be explored further in the book Adventures of a Narrative Gardener by Ronald Fleming.
So Jay, now we're going to go from the classicism of this 1910 Ogden Codman house to the classicism of this 1923 Rolls-Royce Piccadilly Roadster.
I'm anxious to go for a ride in this. Hop in.
Let's go. So the classic life certainly doesn't get more classic than a vintage Rolls-Royce.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. You know, when I was a kid and I worked at the foreign motors dealership, we had a customer named Mr. Smith, Swift. His name was Swift. And he was given, when he was 21 years old, a brand new Rolls-Royce like this. And when he died at 103, 104, he was the longest continuous owner of a Rolls-Royce.
Now tell me, he lived in Springfield, Massachusetts,
That's
did he not?
correct, yes, yes.
I remember, in fact, when I was in college, I had a singing job at the Congregational Church in Hartford, Connecticut. He was a member there. He would actually occasionally drive that car down to Hartford for church services.
Right.
It was unbelievable. unbelievable.
Isn't that funny?
It was fabulous.
There we go. Torquey motor.
Very torquey. And, you know, it doesn't have the same kind of urge that a 1920s Bentley would have, but then again, totally different kind of car.
Totally different kind of car. By 1923, this motor is getting pretty long in the tooth. You know, Rolls-Royce was always a triumph of workmanship over engineering. You know, they weren't really, I mean, they were wonderful cars and beautifully made. And the workmanship was so impeccable. I mean, every connection was tight. I mean, they were really good. But by this time, faster overhead valves, a lot of things had come along which kind of took away some of the luster of the Rolls-Royce.
Well, it's something that you mention a lot, Jay, which is engineering and precision versus workmanship.
Right.
And that high quality workmanship and detail can allow manufacturers to stay with older technology a lot longer than some other manufacturers that frankly were looking for economies of scale and a way of making things more efficiently and more cheaply.
Be careful, you only got rear wheel brakes.
That was it was like driving the 1916 Packard Twin Six on the Pebble Beach tour. That car's got a lot of go. You've driven that car.
Yeah.
And the stop is something which has to be very deliberate.
We don't really stop, you retard progress.
Yes.
Well, you know, that's a perfect example because that 1916 Twin Six 12-cylinder is so much smoother and more fun to drive than this Rolls-Royce,
Absolutely,
which
100%.
seems clunky and heavy, you know. But then again, there is something regal about driving this. When one looks at all the little adjustments on the steering column, how each switch has just the correct amount of detents and it clicks from one to the other. You know, if you're the type
deliberate.
if you're the type of person who enjoys winding a mechanical watch before you go to bed on the nightstand, this will appeal to you a great deal.
It's got a certain sense of style that you don't expect to find in this particular model. And I think that also adds to the charm and appeal of this particular car. We've spoken a lot about before the attention to detail and the attention to the driving experience. And when you drive a car like this, you really are very aware of everything that's going on the road at all times.
Right.
And for me, certainly, the fact that this car is as torquey as it is, I mean, we're still in top gear.
Right.
And basically, you have the performance you need at these speeds to climb gentle hills and things like that. But it's I think the entire spirit, the feeling of what this car does for you, and the fact that, you know, this is a 1923 car.
Right.
It's only 13 years newer than the house that we've just gone to visit.
Right.
And so it really gives you a sense of what the period was like.
Yeah, but it's like you say, you can only live in the time you live in. And if you were 20 years old, you grew up on horses and wagons, and all of a sudden this mechanical device, it's so quiet and so smooth. I mean, it almost seems to like, it just seems unbelievable.
You're gliding along, you know, above, and of course, you're so much cleaner. You're not riding a horse that's leaving a trail. You're not being pulled by a horse that's leaving a trail in front of you. So it's a very, very different experience.
It seems like a wonderful era to have been born in the 1900s, because you're born into an agricultural society. I mean, there are people who saw the Wright brothers flight and also saw us land on the moon.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty amazing. 100 years.
And I think about the life of my grandmother, who died in 1986 at 104.
Wow.
Born in gaslight and dying in space travel.
And here's the amazing part: she died in a skiing accident. Isn't that correct?
Actually, it was bungee jumping.
Bungee jumping.
Yeah. So something that Martha Leno really enjoyed. but you can certainly see in this car all the precepts of Ogden Codman's classicism. You know, that radiator, which was a purely functional object on this car, obviously came to symbolize Rolls-Royce, still does to this day.
Henry Rolls actually dies at age 33. He was the first English person killed in an airplane. He bought a plane from the Wright brothers. And enjoyed and loved flying it, but eventually paid his price.
It's also an interesting but not surprising thing how many early automobile pioneers were also aviation enthusiasts. Because it's just the whole idea at the beginning of the 20th century, sort of conquering nature on the ground and in the air. But that's what I also love about having the experience of these cars, is learning. Because I have to put myself into the car.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that I really enjoy most.
Like people used to believe if you went over 50 miles an hour, you wouldn't be able to breathe. You know, because of the, you know.
You didn't know. So, you know, think about the work that test pilots have done historically. And, you know, people were experimenting, to your point about the fact that, you know, you were going on your horse at a certain speed. Most people were used to walking places.
Right.
And all of a sudden now you're traveling along regularly at 25 or 35 miles per hour.
Yeah.
That's pretty dramatic.
Yeah, I mean, so many questions answered in this period. I remember the big question was, does a horse, when it's galloping, have all 4 feet off the ground? And no one had been able to answer that question until they invented the camera where you could freeze a frame.
Right.
But this is a car you have to master, you know. And I imagine...
Like that silent shift I just made there.
Yeah, that was very good.
Yeah.
But that's what it is. And the more you drive it, you learn its little idiosyncrasies, you know.
Yeah.
It's like that screen door you have to shut exactly the right way to get it to slam. You know, to get it, not slam rather, to get it to click, you know. And I have to admit, it's got a lot of torque. It's quite smooth.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that, you know, I'm always in awe of those people. Obviously, this is not an Alpine Eagle or one of those great silver ghosts, but, you know, the owners that do those great tours that go for thousands of miles across the mountains and all, I think it's absolutely a brilliant thing that they do.
Well, these were quite prevalent in World War I. Lawrence of Arabia used a couple of these, this exact same motor, to help in his conquest.
Yeah, driving one of these with really heavy town car coachwork must have been quite a job. I'd imagine that every chauffeur at the time had the upper body of Charles Atlas.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So they gambled a stamp is what you're saying.
Exactly. And it's interesting, too, because, again, there is a reason why the Bentleys are so prized, because of their driving characteristics. The Bentleys feel heavy, but sort of heavy in a linear way. This feels heavy in sort of a notchy way. But again, you know, comparing this to a 1923 Ford, a totally different driving experience.
But by this time, Cadillac had a V8, and a quite good V8 with twin water pumps. I mean, I've got a 1918 and a 1925, and I would say it is the equal of this, certainly in terms of smoothness and power.
Yeah, I just keep comparing this to the 1916 Packard, and the 1916 Packard is a world ahead of this car.
I mean, when Rolls-Royce came out, it truly was the best car in the world, but the rest of the world caught up pretty quickly.
Another actually interesting comparison with Ford for that.
Yeah.
The fact that the Model T was a terrific vehicle for what it did and for the motoring it brought to the masses, but it sort of stayed too long at the party.
Right.
And by the time Rolls-Royce introduced the Phantom, you know, they were just sort of catching up to the back of the pack.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's another thing about this particular car, is that it's got very sporting coachwork, so you think you sort of want to put on your raccoon coat and dash about the countryside, but it'd be a lot of effort. I'm not a sailor, but there is nothing like feeling that you've got sort of a liner at the helm when you
Right.
sort of aim through a turn and aim the wheel, and then the car sets itself on its course.
Exactly.
And I think it's going to be a very, very different experience from the next car we drive today, which again goes back to sort of American ingenuity, engineering, and presence.
Well, I don't think it'll be that big a surprise because the next car we drive will be smooth, quiet, have a V8, was state-of-the-art back in the day. I mean, General Motors ruled the world. They were the biggest corporation. I mean, people talk about Lincoln and Imperial and all those other makes, but Cadillac outsold them all. It was the standard of the world. They does Leno. I feel like I've absconded with the upstairs maid, you know, and there's so much chasing us when you cut those wheels. Here he comes his father now.
Exactly. I always wondered in the old movies why the people were working so hard at the wheel. Surely this is all acting.
Yeah.
No, it's actually the way they drove.
But it's funny when you watch the old movies, you hear that wonderful second gear whine. You know, these cars used to do back in the day. But even now, I think you're driving this way more aggressively than people would have back in the day.
I think you're absolutely right, Jay.
Now, most people would shift at 1,200 RPM, and you're probably taking it up to 1,800. I mean, you're driving like a modern car.
Yeah, it's difficult to lose the modern mindset.
Right, because
Yeah.
you all want, you know.
It really is. Yeah, these are cars that you got into top gear as soon as you could,
Right.
and you basically left them there,
Yeah.
letting the engine do the work. Well, there's nothing like a challenge, and I love a challenge. And so the next one's going to be getting this car through the gate at Bellevue House. And finally, a totally different kind of classicism from a very different period. This 1956 Pontiac Star Chief convertible.
All right.
give
This
her a
is
roll.
something from the mid-price field.
The mid-price leader, I think.
Was it the leader? All right, let's find out.
And so here we are in another classic expression of 1950s style.
Well, you know, you have to realize when this car was built, it was probably the greatest prosperity period in American history. We had won World War II. We're on the right side of the war. We were doing all the right things. You're a young soldier, you come home, you buy your tract home in Levittown or somewhere, you know what I mean? You could buy a house, you could live way better than your immigrants' parents did. You weren't in a tenement apartment. And the first thing you bought was a new car. And this was sort of a perfect example of what you would get. This was certainly not the most expensive, not the cheapest. What did this have, a 316 cubic inch V8 engine?
316 cubic inch V8. It
Yeah.
had just been introduced the year before.
Right.
The great Silver Streak V8. And again, I always love the marketing names that everything
Right.
received in those days. It's just absolutely fantastic. So it's wonderful also to think about the great GM ladder of brands.
Yeah, yeah.
Pontiac is the mid-priced car.
Right.
But there's a level of detail here that made you feel as if you've accomplished something
Right.
rather than buying a Chevrolet. You
Right.
see the extra that you're getting.
And everybody bragged in the ads, the leader in the low price field, the leader in the mid price field, the leader in the high price field. I mean, you're always in some kind of a field.
Exactly.
And that always made me laugh. But this was, compared to what you would get in England, the Mini, I think, had yet to be introduced, or very
Correct.
close.
Correct.
So English people would buy a motorcycle with a sidecar and get a lot of rain gear and put the whole family in a sidecar and go on a trip. You come to America, oh my God, you got this enormous automobile with a V8 engine. Hilarious.
The concept of this car for a European was absolutely astonishing. A car with an effortless, powerful V8 engine that would fit 6 comfortably, not
Yeah.
crowded,
Yeah.
and that could drive for hours and hours near its top speed.
Right,
I mean,
right.
something completely foreign to the European experience.
Yeah.
And again, thinking about the 1950s, a lot of people have a tendency to think of 1950s as the time of excess in American cars. You look at the mid-50s cars like this Pontiac, I think it's really elegant. I mean, the detailing is really interesting. The silver streaks on the hood, I think, are really cool. The airplane hood ornament. It still has a lot of decoration, but it's not at all gaudy. And I love the two-tone paint job.
I think 58 was the top of excess. Chrome was put on with a ladle, just kind of flap it on there. The 58 Buick, oh my God, had so much chrome.
58 Buick Century, with that big chrome spear on the back of the car.
Right.
But this is an incredibly tasteful car. And when you think about, as well, what it meant to be able to drive a car like this, the freedom and the space, and to have your very own land yacht.
I've got a 58 Rocket 88, and all I did was put vintage air in it. It is the most comfortable car. I mean, it's very funny. Those of us, when we started reading car magazines like Road and Track and Car and Driver, these were the anti-cars. These are the cars they railed against.
Right. Big sloppy American Detroit sedans.
Yeah, right, kind of thing. And you had your little MG with the driving gloves and the tonneau cover and all
That's
that.
right.
Yeah, they're very funny, but
yeah, all those guys in the string back gloves. The guys in the string back gloves and their Austin Healey's said, "Oh, look at that grandpa in his Pontiac convertible."
Right. Yeah, but these really were not bad handling cars. Everybody wanted that boulevard ride, Don't forget the national highway system was just coming into fruition there with President Eisenhower signing the highway. To get on and go 60, 70 miles an hour was unbelievable.
When we were driving earlier in the Mercedes, we were talking about the V8 power and what that meant both to the American market and in the delivery of the driving experience.
Right.
And then in the Rolls-Royce, where we saw that they were really sort of chasing technology in the market in terms of power plant. And here you so rightly point out the fact that this V8 is one of the things that helped put one of our favorite marques out of business. The fact that GM and Ford, well, Ford had this V8 since the 1930s, but that Packard and Hudson couldn't develop V8 engines.
Right.
And that was a requirement for the
the
market.
advertising of the period is the most fun because they'd have little tiny people. The cars would be maybe 10 or 50% bigger in the ad, and they always had, for the man who carries success with ease, and the guy is, the kids are in the back and he's driving along. It's hilarious, very funny.
Well, to your point about the confidence that was just exuded from these cars and from this very particular American period.
And the people who benefited the most was our generation. Because when I was in high school in the 60s, you could buy a car like this, convertible, for $100. It needs a little bit of work. And,
right, use a little oil, but,
that kind of thing. And I realized all the great cars. Guys used to go buy cars like this for $100 to do demolition derbies in. Because we thought, well, you want cars from the 20s and 30s. Nobody's ever going to want something from the 50s. And they all just got sort of destroyed.
And it's that interesting thing about how collecting evolves.
Yeah.
The fact that there was a time when this was just either a student or first driver's junker,
right,
to being a prized object. And you think about sort of the attitude. You watch movies. That's always very interesting to me, to watch a movie when they started shooting movies on location on a regular basis in the 1960s and 1970s, and you see all of the 1950s cars that were still on the street in use.
Right, yeah.
And so you think, oh, well, everybody in the 1960s got a new car and 1970s got a new car. No, people would drive these cars for 20 years.
Right.
And it's also interesting to think about the survival rate. Arguably, although they certainly make cars more durably today, I think that the survival rate for some of these cars might actually be higher than some of the cars that they manufactured in the 90s.
Just in sheer numbers, you still can't match the numbers they put out in the 50s and 60s. I mean, as I always say, the Corvair was considered a failure because they only sold 1.8 million. 1.8 million. I mean, that's unbelievable. Ford was cranking out cars. Oh my gosh. After the war, hundreds of thousands of cars a month GM was producing.
Yeah, it's also a miracle to think about the assembly line process, people talk a lot about quality control today, and quality control was not really something that was discussed in the 1920s and 30s because it was simply you built a vehicle, it was built the way it was built, and that was that. And when you realize that when you get to this time period and you look at some of the details on this car, it's actually quite amazing how well some of these cars are put together because of all the individual trim pieces that have to line up and the complexity of the assembly of this car. They would never ever do something like that today.
I'll give you an example. I have a 55 Buick Roadmaster. I bought in 72
Such
for
an
$350.
aptly named car.
Yeah, Roadmaster. And you know, we put Corvette suspension and everything in, and when we had it apart on my shop floor, and this was in the early 2000s, the whole car was laid out, and some GM people walked through, and the guy looked at the suspension piece and go, you know, we're still using that. And it was a bracket of some sort. But you realize it had been amortized down to like, what, 10 cents? I mean, they've been making this bracket since the 50s, and they're using it on a modern car. I mean, so they're able to build fairly efficiency with a huge profit margin in there.
Talking about manufacturing efficiency, it's also quite an interesting thing because, of course, this was the heart of the regular model year change. So the same basic body shell was changed every year over a 3-year span until they came out with the restyling.
Right.
So you look at all the trim pieces that were unique to a year.
Right. And you realize this is an era when an auto worker could work in a factory and support a housewife and 2 or 3 kids and own a home.
Right.
I mean, now, most people, if you work in assembly, you probably have to have a 2-income family. But during the 50s, you could live pretty good.
Yeah,
on the United Auto Workers salary.
Building on what Henry Ford had started with paying a wage so that his workers could afford to buy the products they built.
Right.
The auto industry, building cars and all of the accessories factories that supplied the auto industry really created a great blue-collar middle class that was unequaled anywhere else in the world.
And there was an optimism that is missing now. You know, that's something I find disappointing. We're becoming like the English. We enjoy noble failures more than successes, you know.
And the idea of actually making something with your hands rather than sort of thinking of an idea instead.
Yeah, I mean,
things still need to be constructed.
Yeah, people revel in the idea of someone else's failure as opposed to looking at it as a learning experience, you know?
But that's one of the great things about enjoying today an historical object like this that you can actually use.
Yeah, I mean, the place where it falls apart is an accident. I mean, you hit a tree at 10 miles an hour, you could be dead in this thing. You know, you go down the road now and see kids have rolled an SUV with 4 of his friends in it, and they all walk away, and they're fine, you know. Whereas at this thing, oh my God. I mean, we lost so many friends in high school from just stupid accidents that would never happen today, just by superior engineering. And the wonderful thing about owning a car like this in California instead of the East Coast is it'll last forever. You know, I mean, you've got a desert climate, you've got no moisture in the air, so the steel to make these cars was not the best, and they all tended to rust out within a year or 2. My dad bought a new car like every 2 or 3 years, and by the middle of the second year, you'd see bubbles on the fenders from water being thrown up and then getting trapped in crevices. You know, they'd all rust out.
It is one of the great challenges of being a caretaker of a vintage or veteran car here on the East Coast. But I think it's something that, frankly, bonds the owner to the car. You're an East Coast, even though you've lived on the West Coast for half a century.
Right.
You're still an East Coaster. You're drawn back magnetically to your roots here, and it's one of those things that I appreciate being a native Northeasterner and having lived in California for almost 2 decades. The opportunities to drive my cars.
Right.
It's a real thrill as opposed to, oh, it's just another day, I'll take the convertible out tomorrow.
Right.
But I think that the 3 cars we sampled today, I think all expressed in their own way the benefit of a classical design and of restraint but presence. Much like you.
Yes,
You're restrained and I'm present.
That's right. There you go. A prescient, yes.
That too. So I think we've had a great day, and let's point those silver streaks towards the ocean and enjoy this beautiful afternoon.